Claire Miller was a lonely wife, Jason Carter was the teenage neighbor she should have ignored, and Daniel Miller was the unsuspecting husband caught in the middle. Together their lives collided in a web of obsession and betrayal that ended not with love, but with blood on the living room floor. The Miller family lived on a quiet suburban street, where houses looked almost identical, lawns were neatly trimmed, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves without ever really knowing one another. Daniel Miller was considered a reliable man, a construction supervisor who left for work before sunrise and often returned well after sunset. He was hardworking, dependable, and respected by those who knew him. His wife Claire, on the surface, fit the role of the dedicated homemaker. She ran errands, kept the household in order, and looked after their teenage daughter, who was still finding her way through high school. To outsiders, the Millers appeared stable, ordinary, and uneventful. Yet, within this carefully maintained appearance, there was a growing emptiness in Claire's life that no one could see. Claire had married young, charmed by Daniel's stability and the promise of security. But years later, her days had blended into routines that left her feeling invisible. Daniel's long hours at work, though necessary, created an emotional gap. Their conversations were brief. Their moments together rushed, and intimacy had dwindled into something she could barely remember. For Claire, loneliness became a constant presence, one she tried to suppress with chores, social gatherings, and small distractions, but it always returned in the quiet of the evenings when Daniel was away. The change in their neighborhood came quietly. With a moving truck pulling into the driveway next door one afternoon, a new family arrived, bringing with them the ordinary buzz of introductions and settling in. Among them was Jason, a tall and athletic 17-year-old known at school for his skills on the field, but also whispered about for his troubled background. Teachers said he had potential, but he often acted out, restless and unpredictable. In the neighborhood, though, he was just another teenager adjusting to a new place. Jason first met Claire casually, offering to help when he noticed her struggling with grocery bags from the car. His friendliness was unexpected, his energy in stark contrast to Daniel's tired presence at home. Claire, starved for attention, found herself smiling more easily in Jason's company than she had in a long time. At first, it was nothing more than neighborly kindness. Jason helped mow the lawn when Daniel wasn't around, carried heavy boxes into the garage, and occasionally lingered to chat while Claire prepared iced tea. But slowly, those brief encounters began to shift. Jason returned more often, his reasons to be there less about helping and more about simply being near her. Claire, despite knowing the dangerous line she was approaching, didn't stop him. She was flattered by his attention, by the way he looked at her as though she was more than just a housewife stuck in the monotony of middle age. She hadn't felt desired in years, and Jason, with his youth and intensity, filled that void. At first, their interactions were carefully hidden behind the safe mask of chores and neighborly conversations. Jason would help rake leaves in the yard while Daniel was gone, or stop by to borrow tools he didn't need. But Claire began to notice the way he lingered at the door, the way his eyes locked with hers, unashamed and daring. What had started as harmless contact was slowly transforming into a secret that threatened everything she had built. The suburban street, so calm and uneventful on the outside, held a dangerous secret that not even the closest neighbors could have suspected. As weeks passed, Jason became more entangled in Claire's life. He was bold, unafraid of how close he stood to her. And Claire, though torn with guilt, couldn't resist the thrill. It was as if the walls of her quiet home had become the backdrop to a double life she never planned but could not abandon. Daniel remained oblivious, consumed by his work and blind to the subtle changes happening under his own roof. Neighbors, too, overlooked the unusual closeness between Claire and Jason, dismissing it as a boy helping out a family friend. Yet the truth was already spiraling beyond control. Every secret glance, every private moment, and every risky encounter was another step closer to disaster. In that quiet suburban setting, where every driveway looked alike and every family seemed safe, a storm was gathering. Claire believed she was simply indulging in a dangerous distraction, but what she failed to see was how much Jason was becoming consumed by her. He wasn't just passing time. For him, Claire was an obsession, and one that would soon push them both into a tragedy that no one on the street would forget. The secret relationship between Claire and Jason grew quickly, like a fire spreading in the dark where no one could see it. At first, Claire told herself it was temporary, just a fleeting distraction to fill the emptiness that had taken over her marriage. But what began as a reckless escape soon transformed into something far more dangerous. Jason, young and impressionable, wasn't satisfied with stolen afternoons or hushed encounters behind closed curtains. His emotions ran deep, and he clung to Claire as though she was the only anchor in his turbulent world. Their meetings became more frequent, more reckless. Jason found excuses to be at the Miller house nearly every day, and Claire no longer fought to stop him. She tried to keep their interactions hidden. But there were moments when her judgment slipped. A neighbor once spotted Jason leaving the Millers' backyard late in the evening. Another noticed the boy's car parked too often near the house when Daniel was away. Whispers began to stir, but Claire ignored them, convincing herself that people always gossip without knowing the truth. What she didn't realize was that secrets this large rarely stay buried for long. Claire's daughter, too, sensed that something was wrong. The girl noticed the sudden tension in her mother's behavior, the way she seemed distracted, always sneaking glances toward the window as if waiting for someone to appear. At dinner, Claire sometimes drifted off into silence, replaying earlier moments with Jason instead of listening to her family. Daniel, however, saw none of it. His long hours at work left him exhausted. By the time he got home, his only thoughts were of dinner, a shower, and rest. The distance in his marriage had become so normal that he didn't even notice how far things had slipped. Meanwhile, Jason's attachment grew darker. For him, Claire was no longer just a forbidden thrill, she was an obsession. He began to see Daniel not as her husband, but as an obstacle standing in his way. Jason wanted more than stolen moments, he wanted Claire completely, and the thought of her returning to her routine life filled him with anger. He pressed her to leave Daniel, to make their secret relationship public, but Claire resisted. For her, the affair was reckless but contained, something she believed she could end when she chose. She underestimated Jason's intensity. As the relationship deepened, Jason's behavior became unpredictable. He showed up unannounced, banging on the back door when Claire ignored his calls. He left notes tucked under her windshield wiper, some romantic, others demanding. At first, Claire felt flattered by the attention, but soon the excitement turned into unease. She realized he was watching her more closely than she thought. Neighbors reported seeing him pacing outside late at night, standing across the street staring at the Miller house as if guarding it. The boy who once seemed like an escape was now beginning to feel like a threat. Claire tried to pull back, to distance herself, but the damage was already done. Jason didn't respond well to rejection. Each time she tried to end things, he grew more volatile, accusing her of betraying him, of choosing her husband over him. His anger flared in ways that frightened her. Yet she still couldn't bring herself to confess the truth to anyone else. The risk of Daniel discovering the affair terrified her more than Jason's outbursts. So she kept quiet, hoping the situation would somehow fade away on its own. But nothing faded. Instead, the walls began closing in. The whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. The uneasy stares from her daughter became harder to ignore. And Jason's behavior escalated with every passing day. He called at odd hours, left cryptic messages, and made it clear that if Claire would not choose him, he would not simply walk away. What had begun as a secret passion was mutating into a dangerous game of control and fear. The fragile balance Claire thought she maintained was gone. She no longer controlled the affair controlled her. Every time Daniel left for work, she felt both relief and dread. Relief that he wouldn't discover her secret that day, and dread that Jason might show up uninvited. The once quiet suburban street that had always felt safe was now filled with unseen tension, a tension that was about to break. In those moments, Claire still believed she could manage the situation if she kept it hidden, if she just continued pretending that nothing was wrong. But behind her denial was a truth that would soon surface in the most violent way. Jason was not letting go. He had already crossed lines in his mind, and it was only a matter of time before he acted on the dangerous obsession that had taken root. The relationship between Claire and Jason had reached a point where control was no longer possible. What once felt like an escape had become a trap, and Claire found herself caught between fear of exposure and fear of the boy she had allowed into her life. Jason's emotions burned hotter each day, his obsession tightening around her like a noose. He didn't just want her attention anymore, he demanded it. He began appearing at the house uninvited, his presence impossible to hide. Neighbors noticed him lurking, Daniel's relatives mentioned seeing him too often, and whispers turned into suspicions that something was terribly wrong inside the Miller home. One evening, the balance finally tipped. Neighbors later told investigators they had heard raised voices coming from the Miller's house. It was unusual, as Daniel was not known for fighting loudly with his wife. The sounds were sharp, frantic, and unsettling. No one called the police that night, assuming it was just an argument that would pass, but by morning the truth could no longer be ignored. Daniel didn't show up to work. For a man who never missed a day, who prided himself on punctuality, this was alarming. By midday, when calls to his phone went unanswered, a concerned relative decided to check on him. The relative knocked on the Miller's door but received no answer. After a tense wait, the door was pushed open, and the grim reality came into view. Daniel was lying lifeless in the living room. His body was sprawled on the floor, his head bloodied from a violent blow. Furniture was disturbed, a lamp knocked over, and shards of broken glass glittered on the carpet. The scene was chaotic, but one thing was clear: this was no accident. Police were immediately called, and within minutes the once quiet street was filled with flashing lights, uniformed officers, and hushed voices of stunned neighbors gathering at their fences. As detectives began piecing together what had happened, Claire presented herself as a shaken widow, distraught and confused. She claimed she had been upstairs when the incident occurred, hearing nothing until it was too late. But her story didn't sit right. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. It was difficult to believe that such violence could erupt without her knowledge in a home as small as theirs. Suspicion began to cloud her every word. Attention soon shifted toward Jason. It wasn't long before his name surfaced, whispered among neighbors who had noticed his frequent visits. One neighbor mentioned seeing him enter the Millers' house the previous night. Another recalled spotting him loitering near the property just hours before the commotion. Detectives quickly connected these accounts with inconsistencies in Claire's version of events. If Jason had indeed been there, then why hadn't Claire mentioned it? And if she was hiding his presence, what exactly was she trying to conceal? Forensic investigators combed through the house, searching for traces of the intruder Claire insisted must have been responsible. But instead of signs of a break-in, they found subtle clues pointing inward. A drinking glass on the kitchen counter held Jason's fingerprints. Surveillance footage from a camera down the street showed him walking toward the Miller house that evening. And phone records painted an even clearer picture. Late-night calls and text messages exchanged between Claire and Jason, some hastily deleted but recoverable enough to prove a pattern of secrecy. The evidence grew heavier with each discovery. The theory of a burglary gone wrong collapsed, replaced by the possibility of a crime of passion. Investigators began to suspect that Daniel's death was not random, but the violent result of a tangled relationship kept in the dark for too long. Claire's behavior added to their suspicions. Though she cried during questioning, her answers were hesitant and carefully chosen. Detectives noted that she seemed less shocked than one might expect, as if she had anticipated something terrible before it happened. The community was stunned as rumors spread. The perfect family image had cracked wide open, revealing betrayal, secrecy, and violence. Neighbors who had once admired Claire now whispered about her in hushed tones, piecing together the truth they had ignored. Jason, once seen as just another teenager trying to find his place, was suddenly at the center of a murder investigation. By the end of that week, police were confident they had identified the key players in Daniel Miller's death, but the question remained: was this the impulsive act of a jealous teenager, or had Claire herself played a much larger role than she was willing to admit? The answer, as investigators soon discovered, was far more shocking than anyone on that suburban street could have imagined. Detectives took little time in focusing their attention on the tangled connection between Claire and Jason. What had at first seemed like a straightforward case of domestic tragedy began to reveal hidden layers of deceit. The night of Daniel's death was reconstructed piece by piece, using phone records, security footage, and statements from neighbors who had noticed strange activity around the Miller home. Every step deeper into the investigation made it harder for Claire to maintain her carefully crafted image of innocence. The first breakthrough came from digital evidence. Investigators retrieved deleted text messages between Claire and Jason, many of which contained phrases that suggested more than just casual communication. One message hinted at Claire feeling trapped. Another showed Jason's frustration at being kept secret, and a late-night exchange the evening before Daniel's death carried undertones of desperation. While Claire told police she was asleep upstairs at the time of the crime, these records suggested otherwise. She had been in contact with Jason well past midnight. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera added further suspicion. Though the video was grainy, it captured a figure resembling Jason walking toward the Miller house late that evening. The shape and build matched him, and investigators noticed his distinctive athletic stride. There was no footage of him leaving. This gap in the timeline became one of the most critical pieces of the case. Inside the Miller home, forensic investigators uncovered even more troubling details. The glass in the kitchen that bore Jason's fingerprints could not be explained away as innocent. Combined with traces of his DNA found on a discarded piece of cloth in the trash, it was clear he had been inside the house during or near the time of Daniel's death. The murder weapon, a blunt object taken from the Miller's own garage, showed both Jason's fingerprints and smudges that suggested someone else had handled it as well. Claire's story began to collapse under pressure. She claimed to have no knowledge of Jason being in the house that night, but when confronted with the evidence, her responses grew inconsistent. Detectives noted her tendency to pause for long stretches before answering, as though carefully shaping her words. At one point, she broke down, admitting that Jason had been in the house before, but insisting that he had always come over with harmless intentions. This confession opened a new path for the investigators of the affair. Neighbors soon confirmed what had long been whispered. They had seen Jason spending unusual amounts of time at the Miller home when Daniel was at work. They recalled late-night visits, unexplained noises, and even glimpses of the two together in the backyard. What once seemed like innocent help from a neighbor now appeared as the foundation for motive. Police pieced together the theory that Daniel had discovered the affair or was close to finding out, and that discovery led to his violent end. The case made headlines quickly. A married woman entangled with a teenage neighbor, a husband brutally killed in his own living room, and a community left in shock. It was a story that captured attention far beyond the quiet suburban street. Media outlets painted Claire as manipulative and Jason as unstable, creating a sensational narrative that fueled public fascination. Yet for detectives, the story was more complex than the headlines suggested. Prosecutors began preparing their case with two possibilities in mind. Either Jason, consumed by jealousy, killed Daniel in a fit of rage, or Claire had played an active role, using Jason's obsession as a weapon to rid herself of her husband. Evidence seemed to support both scenarios, and the challenge lay in determining who held the greater responsibility. Investigators leaned toward a darker conclusion: Claire had manipulated Jason, feeding his emotions until he acted out her unspoken desires. The timeline established by phone records painted a chilling picture. Calls and texts between Claire and Jason increased dramatically in the days leading up to Daniel's death. The night of the murder, several short calls were made just before the estimated time of Daniel's fatal injury. This evidence suggested coordination, not coincidence. Claire denied any involvement, but her denials rang hollow in the face of mounting proof. As investigators prepared for trial, Jason was taken into custody. His demeanor swung between defiance and vulnerability, often portraying himself as a victim of Claire's influence. He insisted that she had promised to leave her husband, that she had made him believe they could have a life together. When asked about Daniel, Jason's words became scattered, hinting at a confrontation but never fully admitting guilt. His refusal to provide a clear account only deepened the mystery of what had truly happened inside that house. For Claire, the facade of the grieving widow shattered completely. Her involvement was undeniable, even if the exact details were still unclear. The public watched in disbelief as the image of the dutiful wife crumbled, replaced by the portrait of a woman who had risked everything for a forbidden affair. The suburban neighborhood that once seemed so ordinary now carried the stigma of a crime that revealed how fragile appearances could be. By the time the prosecution had gathered enough to move forward, the narrative had shifted irreversibly. This was no longer just the story of a jealous teenager. It was the unraveling of a calculated deception, one in which lust, betrayal, and manipulation had conspired to bring about Daniel's death. The quiet suburban street had turned into the backdrop of a scandal that exposed the darkest corners of human desire. The trial drew attention from across the state, with reporters crowding the courthouse steps and neighbors filling every available seat inside. It was not only the brutal killing of Daniel Miller that made the case so gripping, but the scandalous details that surrounded it. A married woman entangled with her teenage neighbor, a secret affair that spiraled into violence, and the shocking question of who was truly responsible. For the prosecution, the challenge was not in proving that Jason had been at the Miller home that night. The challenge lay in proving just how deeply Claire was involved. Jason was presented as a volatile young man driven by obsession. Prosecutors argued that his youth made him reckless, but his actions were deliberate. The evidence showed that his fingerprints were on the murder weapon, his DNA was in the house, and his messages to Claire were filled with threats and demands. The prosecution painted him as the one who struck Daniel down in a jealous rage. Yet they also introduced the possibility that Jason had not acted alone, and that the guiding hand behind his violence belonged to Claire. Claire's defense team tried to present her as a victim of manipulation, a woman who had fallen into a dangerous relationship she could not escape. They argued that Jason was unstable, that he stalked her, pressured her, and ultimately forced his way into her home. Claire's tears on the witness stand were meant to sway the jury, but the prosecution countered with evidence of her complicity. The deleted messages, the surveillance footage, and the coordinated timing of her late-night calls painted a picture not of a victim, but of a woman carefully weaving lies to cover her tracks. The most damning piece of evidence came when forensic experts testified about the murder weapon. While Jason's fingerprints were clear, traces of Claire's DNA were also present. She had tried to explain it away, claiming she may have touched the object during normal household chores, but prosecutors argued that her presence on the weapon showed direct involvement. To them, it was proof that she was not merely a bystander but an active participant in planning or even carrying out the attack. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Jason as a boy manipulated by an older woman, trapped in emotions too heavy for his age. Others saw him as a violent teenager who had made his own choices and committed a brutal crime. Claire, once viewed as the picture of suburban respectability, was now portrayed as a woman who destroyed her family through lies and selfish desires. The story consumed the media, each new revelation drawing more attention, each headline fueling the sense of scandal. When the verdicts were finally delivered, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. Jason was convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to decades in prison for taking Daniel's life. The judge acknowledged his youth but emphasized the brutality of his actions, noting that his obsession had turned deadly and that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. Claire's verdict was even more shocking. Found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, she was sentenced to life without parole. The jury believed she had manipulated Jason, luring him into a plan that ultimately ended in her husband's death. The outcome sent ripples of disbelief through the community. Neighbors who had once admired the Miller family now spoke in hushed voices about the scandal. The suburban street where the tragedy had unfolded never recovered from its reputation. The house itself, once filled with ordinary family life, became a symbol of betrayal and destruction. No one wanted to live there, and it stood for months with an empty for sale sign out front, its windows dark, its lawn overgrown. For Jason, prison became a harsh reminder of the consequences of his obsession. Those who knew him wondered if he had ever truly understood the weight of what he had done, or if he had simply been swept away by emotions he could not control. For Claire, life behind bars stripped away any illusion of control she once believed she had. The woman who thought she could manage a secret life and manipulate those around her was now reduced to another inmate, her name spoken only in whispers of infamy. Daniel Miller, the man at the center of it all, became the forgotten victim in the storm of scandal. His life was remembered briefly in news segments and eulogies, but overshadowed by the lurid details of the affair and the courtroom drama. Friends and co-workers remembered him as a hardworking, quiet man, someone who never sought attention and never imagined that betrayal was growing inside his own home. His death served as the tragic end of a story that had begun with secrecy and ended with devastation. The case became a cautionary tale that lingered long after the headlines faded. It was a story about how desire can spiral into destruction, how secrets can corrode even the most ordinary lives, and how the choices of two people pulled into obsession could leave a trail of irreversible damage. What had begun as a quiet suburban existence ended with flashing lights, prison bars, and a family destroyed beyond repair. And in the end, the truth was clear: a forbidden affair had not only ended a marriage, but had also ended a life, leaving scars that would never fade.